The turmoil of post-Soviet Russia in the 90s saw a handful of business people grow rich, while the country itself grew poor. On the world stage, a once proud nation was humiliated. Into the mix of chaotic capitalism and Wild West opportunity stepped a young Stanford business graduate ready to make his fortune. Bill Browder built the largest foreign investment fund in Russia, reveling in deals that saw his investments increase tenfold overnight. Emboldened by his own success, Browder began to speak out about a culture of corporate corruption, soon falling foul of Russia's new president, Vladimir Putin. In 2005, Browder was expelled from the country and declared a threat to national security. His Hermitage investment fund was raided, and he says a complex fraud conducted by Russian officials resulted in the theft of some $230 million. It was a scheme uncovered by Browder's lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, whose later death in prison, apparently the result of torture, gave Browder a thirst for revenge and justice.
The purpose of Putin's regime has been to commit terrible crimes.
In 2012, the United States Congress passed the Magnitsky Act, aimed at freezing the assets of those suspected of financial crimes and human rights abuses. And Magnitsky-style provisions are being adopted by the European Union.
So Russia is a country where 1,000 individuals have stolen all the money.
Bill Browder, multi-millionaire investor turned anti-Putin activist, talks to Al Jazeera. Bill Browder, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera. You've been on record describing yourself as Vladimir Putin's public enemy number one. Is that something that scares you, or do you wear it as a badge of honor?
Well, I would say both. I mean, of course, when Vladimir Putin wants to go after you, he's got resources, and he's not constrained in ways that others are. And so I live a very precarious life, which may end very suddenly and tragically. However, the reason that I'm in this position is that Vladimir Putin and his regime killed my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, for uncovering a massive Putin-connected corruption scheme. And they killed him in a horribly sadistic way at the age of 37. And I've been going after them ever since they killed him. And we've created a law in the name of Sergei Magnitsky in the United States, in the UK, in Canada, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and many other countries. And this law Putin hates so much, and that's the reason why he hates me. And the fact that this law is causing him so much grief is something which shows that we've got him back.
And that's what you wear with pride. You've been convicted in Russia in absentia on 2 counts, accused of tax fraud, arrested very publicly in Madrid last year, accused, among other things, of killing Mr. Magnitsky yourself. And then we come to this meeting in Helsinki between Donald Trump, the US president, and Mr. Putin last year, when Putin said, "We'll give you the 12 indicted military intelligence officers indicted by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, but what we want in return is you, Bill Browder." How did that make you feel?
Well, again, I was actually in America at the time, and Donald Trump's reaction to that was, I think that's a brilliant idea. So I of course, I couldn't feel anything other than a little uncomfortable. But 2 things that made me feel. First was that in America, Donald Trump doesn't have his own personal rendition squad. This has to go through the Department of Justice and the courts, and the United States, the rule of law wouldn't have handed me over to the Russians, whatever Donald Trump's reaction was. But again, the fact that I'm living rent-free in Putin's head shows just how effective the Magnitsky Act has been, that I would be the one thing he brings up at the summit. And so from my perspective, it only emboldened me to carry on and to push harder to get other countries to do the Magnitsky Act.
And it was an extraordinary example, wasn't it, of the state of modern politics and geopolitics. Here's Vladimir Putin, Russian president, all he's done in the last few years in Ukraine and everything decried by Obama and the Obama administration. Donald Trump, willing to embrace the man, willing to trade you for secrets. Extraordinary.
Well, it was extraordinary what he was willing to do, but it was also very comforting to see how the system rallied around to protect me. And the next day he didn't walk back his agreement to this thing. And the next day after that he didn't. But then the Senate, the U.S. Senate, then had a vote. Would it be a good thing or a bad thing to hand me over? And along with, I should point out, 11 others. And they voted 98-0 not to hand me over, which shows that whatever Donald Trump is thinking, that's not a consensus opinion among his people or in America generally.
Now you're involved at the moment, exclusively, I understand, in following the money trail. What happened to the missing millions from your fund in Russia? In the process of that, many people wonder what the basis of this relationship between Trump and Putin is. Is it about money? Is it about favors? Have you, in your following the trail, discovered any secrets there?
Well, everybody asks me that because, so for 9 years, we've been looking to who got the $230 million of tax money that we paid that Sergei Magnitsky discovered was stolen and went back to various corrupt officials. We've traced that for 9 years, and we found all the money. And through law enforcement investigations, through private investigations, through whistleblowers. And so far, there has not been any money that went to Donald Trump. Having said that, there's a lot of money that went to Vladimir Putin.
Okay, well, leaving the money to one side, I mean, you feature in the Mueller inquiry in another respect, in a secret meeting that took place in Trump Tower in mid-2016, campaign time, between Trump officials and a senior Russian lawyer. The key subject matter was you.
Indeed.
Has Mr. Mueller contacted you about that?
Well, I can't really talk about what Mr. Mueller has contacted me about or not, but what I can say is that on June 9th, 2016, Natalia Veselnitskaya, a Russian lawyer,
The lawyer involved in that meeting.
Who went to Trump Tower along with a couple of other Russians and sat down with Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and Paul Manafort. And this is now before Donald Trump, just after he was nominated, before he was elected president. And they said, if your father, talking to Donald Trump Jr., Donald Trump, is elected president, can you repeal the Magnitsky Act, and could you indict Bill Browder? And she wasn't there just as a private citizen. She was there effectively on behalf of Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. And it's remarkable from almost every different standpoint that the Russian government would send an emissary to talk about me and the Magnitsky Act. And it's remarkable that Donald Trump Jr., his son-in-law, and his campaign manager would meet with this Russian to talk about it.
So is it possible, do you think, in the end, that if collusion is proven, that it may turn out that Bill Browder and the Magnitsky Act were powerful motivators?
Well, we know for sure that the Russians were there because of me and the Magnitsky Act, and we know for sure that they supported Donald Trump because they thought he would be more favorable about these issues than Hillary Clinton. And we know for sure that they were willing to do things in order to make that happen. What we don't know is whether Donald Trump personally agreed to that and colluded. All we know is what the Russians' intention was. We don't know what Donald Trump's response was.
Going back to the money trail, the basis of the act, of course, passed by Barack Obama or under the administration of 2012, how successful in practical terms has it been in the last 6 years in terms of strangling the funds of the oligarchs, in terms of calling human rights abusers to account?
Well, so extremely successful. It's been a dramatic and sort of tectonic success. And why has it been so successful? Because of the nature of Russia. So Russia is a country where 1,000 individuals have stolen all the money from the country. Literally, 1,000 individuals have stolen $1 trillion over a 20-year period. So they've stolen all this money, and so the other 145 million Russians are in destitute poverty. There's 1,000 individuals. And so historically, when you do sanctions, you sanction a country, and it's all very blunt, and the average person starves, and the elite, they fly in their champagne and caviar and private jets. But instead, what the Magnitsky Act does, and the successor sanctions rules have done, which have all been copies of the Magnitsky Act, is go after those 1,000 people. And if they're ready to kill for money, there's nothing more painful for them to have their money frozen. And even if you haven't frozen their money, just the idea that their money could be frozen, it's like a sword of Damocles hanging over their head. And that's why Putin hates the Magnitsky Act so much, is because he's a kleptocrat, first and foremost. I believe he's worth $200 billion. I believe that he keeps that money in the name of other people offshore. And if that money is put at risk of being frozen, and some of it has been frozen, that touches him
more than anything else.
That more than anything else.
The Act has also had its powers expanded. It's not just focused on Russia. Used recently against 17 Saudis believed responsible for the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Was that a victory for you, to find that the Act was now being broadened out?
So after the Magnitsky Act was passed in 2012 by Senator John McCain and Senator Ben Cardin, they looked at Putin's reaction, which was hysteria. He literally lost his cool. And they said, we're onto something big here. And there's no reason why a Chinese villain, Saudi villain, or a Venezuelan villain should be able to get a better deal than the Russian villains. And so they created the Global Magnitsky Act, which passed unanimously in 2016, which goes after bad guys everywhere. And the United States government has been rolling it out quietly and steadily across all different parts of the world. And when Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered, I saw this and I thought, this is like the textbook case for the Magnitsky Act. He was a truth teller. He was exposing corruption in his regime, in the regime that he came from, in the Saudi regime. And then they lured him to the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and extrajudicially murdered him in the most gruesome and horrific way. If there was no, this was the textbook case for the Global Magnitsky Act, and then they used it. They used it on 17 Saudis. Now they didn't use it on Mohammed bin Salman, and I, along with many members of Congress, think that that's really bad.
And expanded as well in recent months into the European Union. What do you foresee for its use in the EU? Can you see it, for instance, beginning to influence what appears to be the fairly insidious and creeping Russian influence in European political affairs? I'm thinking of Russian money allegedly used to prop up the populist government in Italy, also suggestions of Russian money being involved in Brexit. Tell me about the European angle.
Well, so Europe is key. The United States is the most powerful country in the world, but if you get the United States doing sanctions and Europe not, then these guys are all going to the south of France and buying villas on the hotel in front of the Hotel du Cap and in Marbella and Sardinia, and so Europe has to conform with the rest of the world in order for this to be an effective policy, and Europe up until now hasn't. Now in December, we had a breakthrough in Europe where they were finally, after 9 years of my campaigning, they finally agreed in principle to do it. But agreeing in principle and having a law, there's a lot of dots to connect, and the devil is in the details. And the one thing I can say is that Europe is where the Russians are most active. They find lots of corrupt politicians and officials in the United Kingdom, in Italy, in Spain, everywhere, and they corrupt them. And so Europe is a very hard place to get this legislation passed. They're fighting like hell behind the scenes right now to try to stop it. And they've got countries like Hungary and Italy who are sort of, at the moment, sort of expressing objections. And even if it does get passed, getting 28 countries to agree on who to sanction is a very hard thing to do. But it is the big prize. If we get Europe, then we got them where it really hits them, which is the villas, all that kind of stuff.
Let me ask you about Sergei Magnitsky now. He was your lawyer in Russia. As you explained, he died in prison in 2009. And all of these global acts and legislation are in his name. Do you feel responsible for his death?
Well, I feel extremely responsible for his death. He wouldn't be dead. He wouldn't have died. He wouldn't have suffered some horrific torture if he hadn't been my lawyer. They effectively tortured him and killed him as my proxy. And he was a young, truly amazing, great man with 2 children, great life ahead of him, and it was cut short in the most horrific way at the age of 37. And for me, every day I feel terrible about that. And it's that feeling of guilt and that feeling of responsibility and that feeling of anger that drives me for nearly a decade to devote my entire life to getting justice for him.
Well, you've talked about revenge. At what point do you imagine you might feel avenged?
Well, it's not about revenge as it's about justice, but you know, justice, revenge.
But revenge is something you've talked about.
It's part of justice. It's that's what justice is. You don't let people get away with murder. But it's gone well beyond Sergei Magnitsky. You know, many other victims come to me with their issues and their problems, and it's become his legacy to try to create a tool. A tool of fighting impunity in his name. And so it's not just about justice or revenge or any of those things, it's also about his legacy.
You've talked about the 1,000 oligarchs, you've talked about the trillions that they stole. Taking you back to your time at the beginning in Russia as the Soviet Union fell, you also made a fortune in a fund that was investing in the privatizations of the day, taking advantage essentially of the collapse of the Soviet system. Isn't that exactly what they did?
That's definitely not what they did. So first of all, what I did was when they privatized the country, they had a stock market, and I invested in the stock market, and I invested in big companies in the stock market. And what I did, which is totally different than what they did, was that the oligarchs and these corrupt officials were stealing from Gazprom, the biggest state company, Lukoil, et cetera. And I came up with an investment strategy which was to help to try to stop the stealing and to expose these guys. And so I was doing just the opposite, which is they were stealing from the state, from the people, from their companies, and I was researching how they were doing the stealing and then exposing the research through the international media to get them to stop it, which is why the regime turned on me and went after me in such a vicious and horrible way.
But isn't there a gap in timing here? Initially you made your money, and then you turned to criticizing the regime. Initially you made your money in much the same way they did, by taking advantage of a collapsing system.
Well, the only similarity is that we were both investing in the system at the very same time. The difference was that almost immediately after I started exposing corruption, which is I think that anybody who knew me in Russia at the time said that's what Russia needs, that's a very brave thing to do, and it's a good thing for Russia. Nobody said it's a bad thing to invest in companies, and I was doing it for money. I wasn't doing it for the goodness of the state, but to invest in companies, expose corruption, and try to stop it, that definitionally is a good thing.
Well, given what was going on at that time then, it can't have come as much of a surprise to you when the rug was pulled out from under your feet, because it had happened to Mikhail Khodorkovsky and other oligarchs. He's now a friend and ally of yours here in London. He stuck his nose into opposition politics, he criticized the Kremlin, and he had his wings clipped, as did all the others. You must have seen that and thought, well, if I carry on like this, the same fate befalls me, or did you feel somehow sort of immune as a foreigner?
Well,
was it arrogance?
It was arrogance, it was stupidity, it was bad judgment, but it was also circumstance. So for a while, I could get away with doing it for a very weird reason, which was that when Vladimir Putin came to power, he was really sort of powerless because the oligarchs were stealing power from him. And so every time I would expose one of these oligarchs, he would come to my aid. This is at the very beginning, around the year 2000. He would come to my aid, and there's this expression: "Your enemy's enemy is your friend." And so, for a while, Vladimir Putin was on my side, to cleaning up Russia. The problem was that he wasn't trying to get rid of the oligarchs. He just wanted to become the biggest oligarch himself, and he effectively did that by arresting Michael Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia. You put the richest man in Russia in jail, and you allow the television cameras to film him sitting in a cage. What's your natural reaction going to be as another oligarch? Is you don't want to be in a cage. And that was the moment that the oligarchs came to him and said, "What do we have to do, Vladimir, to not sit in this cage?" And he said 50%. And so at that moment, and that was in late 2003, going into 2004, that was the moment that Vladimir Putin turned and turned into the biggest oligarch. And that was the moment that my activities became intolerable to him.
No longer useful to him.
Indeed.
I mentioned your arrest in Madrid last year. Interpol warrants out for you, convictions in absentia. Do you fear for your life?
Well, I live in a very precarious position where any day I could be killed, arrested, illegally rendered back to Russia. But I don't spend my life living in fear, because if I did, then they would have already achieved 90% of their objective. And so I take precautions when and how I can. I know that probably all the precautions I take can't prevent the Russians from killing me if they really want to kill me. I carry on doing what I'm doing. I'm not gonna stand down.
Well, you've chosen quite some place in which to do it. London, the UK, a country in which 12, 13, 14 estimated Russian critics have lost their lives, have come to a sticky end in dubious circumstances in just recent years. Why here? Why are you in London? Why are you living such a public existence?
Well, as I said, I'm not the person who's going to live in fear. I'm not the person who's going to withdraw. I'm not the person who's going to go into hiding. My reaction is to go straight back at them, and I'm not going to change locations. And fate may deal me a very ugly blow, but that's the decision I've taken.
Well, from the perspective of being in London, and in the context of the wider European question, which we mentioned earlier, why do you think these things keep happening in Britain? Is it the case that Britain is itself compromised in terms of its ability to deal with Russia because of all the money parked here, because of Brexit, because it can't, in a sense, afford to alienate countries like Russia?
Well, what I've seen is that the British government on a regular basis doesn't create consequences for really horrific crimes committed by the Russian government in this country. Alexander Litvinenko was murdered with radioactive polonium in 2006, and it was discovered that it was the Russian government who did this, the Russian FSB, and there was no serious consequences, just a few diplomats expelled. Alexander Perepelichny, a whistleblower in our case, was killed after jogging outside his home in Surrey. The police didn't even investigate it as a murder. And then, of course, the Skripal poisoning, where high-grade military chemical weapons were used in a cathedral town in the center of the UK. And the only thing that happened was 23 diplomats were expelled. And those 23 diplomatic slots are now being negotiated to be replaced.
Some pretty undiplomatic language passed between the two. But that's
undiplomatic language, words are cheap. There was no consequences. And so it's created an environment to allow this to happen. And then the question is, why? And the answer is that this country is compromised because there is Russian money that's polluted the political process here. And I've seen it up close and personal, where members of the British establishment and British lawmaking bodies are taking money to support Russians in the Magnitsky case and other cases. Take Lord Barker. He's a member of the House of Lords. He's a lawmaker, and he's on the payroll of Oleg Deripaska, running around the world trying to reduce sanctions on him. Why is that not illegal? Maybe it is illegal, I don't know, but that's outrageous. And that's allowed to happen, and nothing's being done about it.
You've described Vladimir Putin not as a man of conviction or ideology, but as a modern-day Pablo Escobar.
Vladimir Putin doesn't have. He's not like Joseph Stalin. He's not doing all these crimes for some communist reason. He's not doing this for some religious reason. He's doing this for money. He's a kleptocrat. All he cares about is money and staying alive. But and that makes him much more similar to a Pablo Escobar than a Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler. The problem is that you give Pablo Escobar the powers of a sovereign state with military and intelligence services and nuclear weapons, and that's an extremely scary combination.
Well, speaking of staying alive, and we certainly hope you do you feel that the efforts that you've put in place now are unstoppable, even potentially come a day when you're not around to lobby constantly in their cause.
Yeah, absolutely. The Magnitsky Act is now turned into a viral phenomenon. It's jumping from country to country to country. There's Magnitsky proposals all over the world in different parliaments and governments, etc. And of course, I can help and I can stir up the pot and make things happen, but without my presence, they would happen at the same time. And in addition to that, the money laundering investigation, the who got the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over, has led to a massive international money laundering investigation which has snared Danske Bank, Nordea Bank, Swedbank, Credit Suisse, UBS, banks all over the world. There's 16 countries with money laundering investigations going on as a result of the Magnitsky case, and it's much, much larger than just the $230 million.
Bill Browder, thank you for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
Thank you.